A family of 4 butchered inside their home. A small county rocked by the tragedy of a senseless crime. A disturbing mystery that reveals no answers, but only more questions. Welcome to the Dominion of Death. I am Ziki, and this is the story of the Kershaw Family Massacre. In the early 2000s, Ike and Victoria Kershaw moved to the rural Virginia countryside and bought a house in Rockbridge County. Along with them were their 2 children, Elizabeth, who went by Lizzie, and Isaiah. For several years, they lived a more or less normal life according to outside observers. Ike and Victoria were considered friendly by their neighbors, and Lizzie and Isaiah were popular and successful in school. Unfortunately, on one particular summer morning, a shocking event would change everything. On June 28th of 2003, a neighborhood friend of Lizzie's named Martha walked down the street to the Kershaw home. Martha rang the doorbell twice, but no one answered the door. She heard nothing from inside the house. She thought this was odd, as the family vehicles were in the driveway, and just the night before, she had made plans to hang out with Lizzie that afternoon. After a moment of waiting around, Martha peeked into the window beside the door to see if anyone was coming. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. She could see that the staircase that led upstairs had bloody streaks running down it. Drops of blood were also splattered all along the floor tiles just inside. Martha ran back to her house and told her parents what she saw, who then immediately called the police. Several police cars soon arrived at the Kershaw home, with officers coming across Martha's father, who had just walked over to check out what was going on at his neighbor's house. An ambulance would show up shortly after. Officers and paramedics made their way inside the Kershaw home and found themselves in what was described as, quote, a literal bloodbath, end quote. All 4 members of the Kershaw family were found dead inside. They had been hacked and beaten to death. In each case, the forensics showed that there was some sort of struggle and that none of the deaths were quick or painless. The murder of mother and wife Victoria Kershaw was particularly gruesome, as her face and body was said to be barely recognizable. Beyond the sheer brutality of the murders, the crime scene inside the house made for a confusing mess to the investigators trying to piece together what had happened. The Kershaws were all found in different rooms and areas of the house. Forensic investigators could not determine who was killed first, or in what order any of them were killed in. Each body was found mutilated, with blood splatters covering the floor and walls of each room a family member was killed in. One of the most peculiar and disturbing aspects of the crime was that it was reported that despite the massive amounts of blood left behind and the level of violence displayed, the police found no bloody footprints on the floors that could have come from the killer or possible killers. The trails of blood leading throughout the house were believed to have dripped from the murder weapons used. While police believed that it would have been nearly impossible that the assailant could have managed to keep from stepping in any of the gore during the assaults, that just seemed to be the case anyways. Another oddity was the fact that none of the victims seemed to have been tied down or restrained. As each death was assumed to have been loud and messy, the investigators could not determine how or why the other members of the family didn't notice what was going on and make some kind of escape. Victoria appeared to have been preparing food in the kitchen. Ike was found in the living room with the TV still on. Lizzie was found in the upstairs bathroom and is assumed to have been in the process of putting on makeup. Young Isaiah was found in his bedroom, reading a comic book. It seemed highly unlikely that none of them would have heard some kind of disturbance as the killer made their way through the house, killing victims one by one in a gruesome manner. However, somehow the killer must have been able to make his way through the house without alerting any of the family members to his presence, until it was too late. As for any forensic evidence found at the scene, none of it would be useful in finding a suspect. No weapons were found in the house or in the nearby area. In fact, no murder weapon would ever be recovered in this case. Another mystery of the crime was that there was no signs of a break-in, with all the doors and windows found locked by the police when they arrived. With no signs of a break-in, it has been suggested that perhaps the killer was known to the family and was simply let in. However, it's also been proposed that, like many who live out in the country, perhaps the Kershaws just left their doors unlocked, which gave the killer free entrance. Then, after the carnage, the killer locked the door behind him. With the lack of evidence or clues left behind in the Kershaw Family Massacre, some believe that the killer must have been experienced, or even a professional. Others are of the idea that it was more the fault of the Rockbridge police that did not properly handle the collection of evidence correctly. It's not every day that a small county police department is faced with investigating the annihilation of an entire family, after all. So it could be that perhaps there was evidence left behind that was just not found or processed in the right way. As news of the terrible crime spread around the county, the questions that immediately came to mind among the neighbors and friends was, who could do such a thing? And why? There are a number of theories as to who was behind the Kershaw Family Massacre, but none have much evidence to back them up. One idea is that the killer was a man who Victoria Kershaw was having an affair with. Since the crime, there have been rumors and statements made by others who knew her that Victoria did have several extramarital affairs in the time they lived in that house. The theory states that perhaps a man fell in love with Victoria, but when she refused to leave her husband for him and instead decided to call off the affair, the enraged man took out his frustration by murdering her whole family. One of the main pieces of evidence backing up this theory is that out of all the Kershaws, Victoria's body received by far the most punishment and mutilation. Therefore, the killer might have done just what was necessary to kill the other family members, but took out all of his rage and frustration on Victoria. Another idea is that the murder was entirely random. During their investigations, the police would publicly state that they could not find anyone who was a clear enemy of the family, or anyone who had a clear motive for wanting to murder any of them, let alone the entire family. Because of this, some think that the massacre was the work of a madman who simply chose the house or family by random, and they did not have any personal relationship with any of the Kershaws. This theory is not entirely unlikely, as there have been a number of cases of serial killers who chose victims or houses at random. What doesn't make much sense to this theory is that the case seems to be quite isolated. There aren't any other group murders in the state or region that seem overly similar. Typically, serial killers will have a pattern, or MO, that can be determined and cross-checked with other cases, but the Kershaw Family Massacre mostly seemed like an isolated and unique family murder. Another theory tied to the murders is more on the bizarre side. Allegedly, Ike and Victoria Kershaw were part of a cult known as the Order of the Ascended Sacraments. This short-lived cult operated in parts of Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. While on the outside, the sect preached that it sought to show its members pathways to enlightenment and the ability to ascend to higher planes of spiritual existence, rumors surrounding the organization insisted that it was actually an instrument for members to indulge in drug-filled sexual fantasies and group orgies. There were several instances of drug busts conducted against suppliers connected to the cult, along with stories of young women who had been invited to ceremonies and ended up being victims of sexual assault. The problem with this theory is that today there is barely any public information available about the now defunct cult. Though there are a number of personal accounts confirming that the Kershaws were in some way related to the cult, why they would be attacked and brutally murdered because of their involvement is entirely unknown. One last thing to note on this theory is that some months after the Kershaw Family Massacre occurred, a local building that was used as a regional headquarters for the cult was burned down in an act of arson. Whether this is somehow related or merely coincidence is anyone's guess. Approaching 2 decades after the murders were committed, there unfortunately exists almost no new information about the crime. Over the years, there have been no breakthroughs or new leads, and at this point, it seems like the Kershaw Family Massacre will live on forever as yet another disturbing unsolved cold case. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dominion of Death. If you have any thoughts on the Kershaw Family Massacre, please leave your comments down below. If you would like to hear more dark stories of disturbing crimes, please like and subscribe. Until next time, Take care.